In this episode, I'm talking about the absolute crazy employment status in the United States for those 55 plus. We are living in really strange times, both good and bad for those who are over the age of 55 in the U.S. Cue the music.
Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast, brought to you by Career Pivot. This podcast is where those of us in the second half of life come together to discuss how to repurpose our careers for the 21st century. Come listen to career experts give you proven strategies. Listen to people like you tell their stories on how they repurpose their careers. And finally, get your questions answered. Your host, Mark Miller, has made 6 career pivots over the last 30 years. He understands this is not about jumping out of the frying pan into a fire, but rather to create a plan where you make clear, actionable steps or pivots to a better future career. Are you ready to repurpose your career?
Welcome to episode 291 of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. My name is Mark Miller, and I'll be your host every Monday for discussion on what it's like to repurpose your career. In this episode, I'm talking about the absolute crazy employment status in the United States for those 55 plus. We are living in really strange times, both good and bad for those who are over the age of 55 in the United States. The employment numbers look very good if you're older, but there's a lot going on under the surface that employment numbers really do not show. I want to dig into this topic. I will reference a number of articles and webinars that I will link to in the show notes. However, before we get to the episode, let's have a word from our sponsor, Career Pivot. The Career Pivot membership community is a group of people from all over the U.S. and Canada with diverse backgrounds. This is a community where everyone is there to help everyone else out, figure out what they want to do in the second half of life, and then make it happen. Many have made changes that they did not know existed or was possible when they came to the community. They learned from each other and broadened their horizons on what was really possible. Let's hear what Alex had to say about being part of the community.
Well, you can't underestimate the value of community, right? To start this transition in my life and to be able to connect with others who were going through it, who had maybe perhaps made the same missteps that I had made, right? Or to the extent to which I could learn from them and not make certain mistakes or share my experience. It really just was a very giving place for me to share information, laugh about the highs and lows, and get information from other people who were interested in my story as much as I was interested in hearing about theirs.
I'm recruiting new members. If you are interested in learning more about the endeavor, please go to careerpivot.com/community. Now, we will discuss the crazy employment status in the United States for those 55 plus. As I've written before, this is one of the craziest economies and job markets I've seen in my lifetime. And I wanted to get a good feel what it was really like for those who were 55 plus. And I started out by going back and looking at the survey I did at the beginning of the pandemic, where we had a super high unemployment rate among the survey recipients. Normally when I've done my surveys in the past, I get, a 10 to 20% underemployment and unemployed. This time we were about 50%, and people were really, really struggling. Well, that was late 2020, and the unemployment rate back then was really high. Now, today the unemployment rates are actually pretty darn good. As I record this, the unemployment rate for the nation is about 3.7, 3.8%. But those for 50 to 54 is 2.8%, and for 55 plus, it's 2.7. In other words, things look pretty good. But is that really true? We all know that the numbers kind of hide some of this. And then when I ran my latest survey, things looked, again, pretty good. As I look at it, I asked a question, how prepared are you for retirement if you're already retired? How confident are you in your retirement situation? And by the way, 76% said they were either confident or somewhat confident that they're ready or prepared. And then I asked what your employment outlook for 2022 and 2023. And 85% of you said we're either optimistic or somewhat optimistic. That's a pretty good numbers. That's a big difference from literally that was approximately 2 years apart. And then in July, I thought that, well, how can I get a really good finger, a pulse of what's going on? And I went out and I said, I'm going to go query a bunch of job club leaders. I was heavily involved with job clubs back in Austin for more than a dozen years. I know a lot of job club leaders. And that's where I normally get a feel for what's really happening. And I ended up querying about 100 different job clubs. Now, unfortunately, they were largely clustered around the New Jersey, New York area and down in Texas, and a smattering a little bit around. And by the way, a number of them had gone out of business. Why? They just simply didn't have people coming anymore. Now, pretty much all the job clubs, not pretty much, all the job clubs went virtual during the pandemic. Almost all are trying to bring people back in. And unfortunately, a lot of you guys who attend job clubs aren't coming back in. And my guess is for obvious reasons. It's called you don't want to get sick. Now, we know, and I said, I found that a number of job clubs had just completely disappeared. Now, a lot of these job clubs, I like to think of it, they're either supported out of religious organizations, i.e. churches or synagogues, or they're run by state or county government. Or like my Launchpad Job Club back in Austin originally was out of state government. In Austin, it was spun out, and it was later made a 501c3. And most of these folks don't have a lot of money to run their job clubs. When they went virtual at the beginning of the pandemic, they saw attendance plummet. Some of them, it took a while to happen. And now as they're trying to come back, as I said, you guys ain't coming back in person. And we don't know really whether it's Zoom fatigue, because one of the things I discovered is a lot of these job clubs have a really personal relationship with their members. And that kind of disappeared in the pandemic. As we went virtual, they kind of lost touch with their membership. And when people stopped showing up, they really didn't know why. And to a large extent, when I talked to people, mostly via email, it was, they didn't know why. It was a pretty much universal going, we don't know whether these folks have retired, they've given up, they've found jobs. Now, when I've asked for, just a general idea, a lot of the job club leaders thought that the economy was pretty good and these folks were doing okay. Now, at the same time, I watched a webinar here recently, put on by a gentleman, Hung Lee, runs a bi-weekly event. I don't know if it's weekly or bi-weekly, called Recruiting Brain Food. It's really targeted at recruiters. Well, he's been doing a number of different things here recently, where he's been putting on this webinar where he's been trying some different topics. And this one was, where are the missing workers? Because we know that our job force labor participation rate has declined, and there are almost 2 jobs for a very unemployed person. Now, we know that the number of unemployed persons probably exceeds the official number, because a lot of times they calculate the number of people who are looking for work by people who are getting unemployment. There are lots of different ways they do it. But they brought in 4 economists, And there were a couple of them that were very interesting. A gentleman from Indeed, and another Dr. Sarah Ali, who was at Radancy. That's it, Radancy. I had a hard time pronouncing that. And she had recently written an article on their blog, on the Radancy blog, called the September 2020 Labor Market Update. And it was quite fascinating. Let me read you a couple of the bullet points here from the beginning. The U.S. labor market is starting to show signs of cooling off as layoffs and discharges have increased by 6.6% over the last few months, while quits have decreased by 3.4%. There were 5.2 million more job openings than workers available, a slight decrease from the previous month. The headline unemployment rate, U3, increased slightly from 3.5 to 3.7 from July to August. The labor force participation rate increased from 62.1 to 62.4 over the same period, indicative of more people entering the labor force. And the job finding rate, which is defined as the proportion of previously unemployed workers who found employment, increased month over month and year over year from 2.8 and 25.4 respectively. In other words, people are getting work and people are working. The interesting one is we know there are a whole bunch of people that have just disappeared. And the discussion in the webinar that I found quite fascinating was the fact that a lot of these people may have disappeared due to long COVID and caregiving. The Census Bureau's Household Pulse Survey was just released, and I'll include a link to the spreadsheet. There are millions of people who are suffering from long COVID. Not a few thousand or a few 100,000, but millions. In fact, on their survey of the 119 million people surveyed, there were about 15 million, or the question is, long-term symptoms reduced ability to carry out day-to-day activities. 4 million responded yes a lot, and 9.9 million responded yes a little. In other words, a lot of people are suffering from long COVID. Some of our labor market shortages are being caused by long COVID or other people needing to care for them. So this is this somewhat surprised me and then didn't surprise me, because it makes sense. In other words, COVID has a very long tail that will take a while to work its way through the system. Similarly, in some discussions with a couple of different people, there's the belief that there are people out there who are our age, 55 and above, and by the way, I'm 66, who are still having a tough time finding work. Now, I had a couple of people comment to me that these are a lot of the long-term unemployed who particularly have probably gotten pretty hammered in the pandemic from a work-wise perspective. They are probably also some of the people who are least likely wanting to come back into the office. And as you become long-term unemployed, the way you get back in is through networking. It's not by applying for jobs. It is going out there and networking a storm up. And that's, by the way, really hard right now. Number one, a lot of people have gotten out of practice. Two, the traditional networking venues have kind of disappeared or have gone on hiatus, and they're only slowly coming back. So in order for you to get out and network, then you're going to have to do a lot of work. I also reached out to Chris Farrell, who calls himself an economics and personal finance expert. And Chris has been on the podcast numerous times. And he pointed to an article on Bloomberg. Again, I will include this in the show notes, called "The 55 and Older Labor Market Exodus is a Statistical Mirage." because the byline says people in their late 50s and early 60s haven't stopped working. And for those over 65, workforce participation declines have been smaller than generally portrayed. In other words, yeah, we saw a blip during the pandemic, but particularly those from 55 to 65 are still out there working. So, when we thought that everybody was going to retire and a lot of people retired, they have not. They are still out there. Everything right now tells me, for most of you, you're in pretty good shape. Now, for those of you who are not, it's hard, and I understand that, but what we're seeing is there are certain markets. I just got a bunch of LinkedIn connection requests for mortgage brokers and in the mortgage industry. We are going to see a number of different segments where we're going to see layoffs. And you can imagine, as at the time here, I think mortgage rates have gotten up to 6%, which from my days in getting mortgages back in the 1970s still looks pretty darn low. There are certain industries that are getting hammered right now, and they are struggling. So if you have a perspective on this, I would love you to send me an email at podcast@careerpivot.com and let me know what you think, because we are living in weird times. Given the inflation and what looks like we're going into a recession, one would think that the job market would be starting to go down and unemployment rates would be going up, and they have a little bit. But in general, it looks like many of you who are 55 plus have recovered from the pandemic's downturn. So let me know what you think. Again, email me at podcast@careerpivot.com, and that'll be in the show notes. I hope you found that interesting. We live in strange times where it's hard to understand what's really going on so you can plan your career and life. Like I said, there will be industries like mortgage brokers who will see some pretty severe declines in employment, and tough times are ahead. I'm still trying to buy that crystal ball from Amazon, but it's still on back order. Take a moment, go to careerpivot.com, sign up for the weekly Career Pivot Insights newsletter, which is sent out every Sunday. You'll get a weekly update on this podcast, white papers, and new blog posts. I recently published my latest white paper, Ageism, the Last Acceptable Bias. While there, do not forget to check out the Career Pivot community, which can be found at careerpivot.com/community. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Look for Career Pivot on Facebook and LinkedIn. You will also find me on Twitter at Career Pivot. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. You will find all the show notes at careerpivot.com/episode-291. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Podbeam, Overcast, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, and lots of other places where podcasts can be found. In fact, this podcast can be found on the Repurpose Your Career podcast channel on YouTube. Hope to see you next Monday for another episode of Repurpose Your Career podcast.